Welcome to On the Air with Accounting Today. I'm Dan Hood. You know, as accountants move to adding more and more value-added services to their roster of service offerings for their clients, they're going to want to use all kinds of tools to help them deepen those services and make them more relevant to their clients and to their staff. They're going to use all the kinds of tools available, and one of them is behavioral economics. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we're here with Jordan Birnbaum, the chief behavioral economist at ADP. He's going to tell us a little bit about that and how it can apply to accountants. Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Dan. Really happy to be here.
Maybe we can start by talking about what behavioral economics is, for those who aren't familiar.
Sure. Well, it's often a good place to start with defining classical economics. And the idea of classical economics is that we are mapping out how people ought to behave if driven by perfectly rational self-interest. The problem is there are a couple of people that I've met in my life that aren't necessarily perfectly rational. And as such, we see a need to start looking at, well, how will people actually behave as opposed to how ought people behave? And that if we can start to understand what's driving those behaviors, we can make better predictions about how our communications, our programs, and the like will land with people and help us get to the outcomes that we want to see. So, simply put, behavioral economics emphasizes the would over the should. We're interested in how people would react as opposed to how they ought to.
Gotcha. Can you maybe give like a couple of real-world examples of something like that, where the rational actor would be different from the homo economicus, I think they used to call that, exactly. would be different from the real person on the street?
Oh, sure. So there's lots of fun examples. Why don't we start with framing? So framing is the idea that identical information presented differently can lead to very different outcomes. So, for example, a doctor might say to you, you have contracted a disease with a 90% survival rate, or the doctor could say you have contracted a disease with a 10% mortality rate. That is the identical information, and yet people will react very differently to hearing those two sentences. So differently, in fact, that it could have a major outcome on what happens next. So, for example, those people who hear about the mortality statistic may be more pessimistic and less likely to follow through with their treatment options and the like. So it's certainly understandable that people would rather hear about the survival rate than the mortality rate, but for our purposes, it's definitely irrational because people should react to identical information identically.
Right. The chances are exactly the same, but just how you hear about it will make a difference. And it's interesting. It's interesting, particularly that because that's sort of a data presentation, right? You should do the exact same percentages, just presented slightly different, give a totally different reaction. There's an obvious, I think, for a lot of accountants, their ears are perking up when they heard numbers, and they said, "Wait a minute, the presentation of data will change how it's received and how it's interpreted."
Massively.
So, I mean, and that's got to have all kinds of implications for, I mean, at the very least, financial planners have got to look at that and say, if I present your long-term plan this way, it makes you nervous and uncomfortable. I present it this way, it makes you happier and more likely to follow through and more likely to keep up with savings, whatever the case may be. Maybe can you give us some examples of how accountants might apply this to themselves, or how they can work this into their practices?
Oh, certainly. So framing is almost the execution, but then we'd have to turn to understanding some of the determining principles that actually affect behavior. So one example of that would be something like loss aversion. This comes from prospect theory, and it turns out that human beings are twice as motivated to avoid losses as we are to secure gains. Put another way, if I were to lose $20 and I wanted to have the equivalent experience in the opposite direction, gaining $20 wouldn't do it for me. I'd have to gain $40 to get to the same level of impact, because losses impact us twice as heavily as gains do. And so when we're thinking about framing, we often will think about framing things in terms of what we stand to lose rather than what we stand to gain. So one area that I work in quite often is leadership development. And I could say to a leader, consider all the career advancement you stand to gain by improving as a leader. Or I could say, consider all the career advancement you stand to lose by not improving as a leader. And by changing two little words, I have just made that second sentence twice as motivating, because I understand what is driving people at an unconscious level, and then I take that understanding and frame it in a way that's going to help get to the sort of the maximum outcome that I'm looking for.
Gotcha. And let's be clear that at all times, because there's a degree to which you say, oh, this is a little manipulative, but let's be clear, we're always using these powers for good, and not to get people to do things that aren't good for them or bad. I mean, obviously they can be, but that's not what we're going to do here, right?
It's very important that you bring that up, actually. And so I would say that there are two ways that behavioral economists address the issue of ethics and morality. And the first is this. So behavioral economics interventions don't become any less impactful if people are aware that they're happening. And so what you'll often see behavioral economists do is point out exactly what it is that they're doing. So in that case, I would say to a leader, I'm framing this in terms of what you stand to lose because I realize that you are more likely to be motivated by what you stand to lose. That's a very human thing. And the second measure, of course, by which to help people avoid unethical practices is simply to educate them, which is why I go around and talk about behavioral economics as often as I can, because I think that the more this becomes commonly understood, the better off we all are.
Well, at the very least, I mean, we can start understanding some of our irrationality. I mean, you know, it may hold for now, but if we get more, that everyone is more loss averse than seeking gain. But in the end, if we start to understand that, we may treat the two more evenly or choose our own priorities. If we can get past the sort of, I don't know what kind of training it is. Is it inbuilt? Is it evolutionary? Where do these...
Well, that becomes a whole other issue. Another anthropological, fascinating dinner time conversation.
We're going to have a 3-hour conference on that later
exactly.
on.
Another example that I think is potentially really important for accountants to understand is the power of the default option, which I consider to be the hammer in the toolbox of the behavioral economist. And the default option is basically what happens when people do nothing. And to give an example of how powerful this can be, we're going to talk about organ donation rates in Germany and Austria, which I could tell you were hoping we were going to talk about.
In fact, I thought that was the subject of the whole podcast.
Yeah, of course. So in Germany, organ donation, they follow an opt-in process. So when you go to the German equivalent of the DMV, you have to check a box to say, yes, I want to become an organ donor. And in Germany, organ donation rate is 12%. Now, what makes Austria such a great comparison is that the societies are very similar. So you'd be surprised to learn that there are wildly divergent attitudes about organ donation. But what Austria does differently is organ donation there is opt-out. So now when you go to the Austrian version of the DMV, you have to check a box to not become an organ donor. In other words, if you do nothing, you're an organ donor. You want to guess what the organ donation rate is in Austria?
Significantly higher is my guess.
99% of Austrians are organ donors.
Wow.
So the clear takeaway is that if you need an organ, it's way better to be Austrian. But the other takeaway is that something as innocuous as checking a box can be the difference between success and failure. So we really have to think very carefully about how we structure the choices that we offer to people, because the architecture of those choices will be the difference between success and failure.
Right. I think there was similar, probably driven from that same case study, there was talk a while back about a similar sort of opt-in, opt-out switch for 401k or retirement savings, so that you would say you will automatically have this much deducted from your paycheck and saved unless you choose not to. And apparently that was a similar huge difference.
In fact, there was a recent study from Fidelity came out that looked at saving rates in people aged 21 to 30. In other words, the people least likely to care. And what they found was that when they had 401k participation as an opt-in, they got a 20% sign-up rate. When it was opt-out, 76%. So it shows you how dramatically that can move the needle. And of course, to a behavioral economist, this is irrational. If we are aware of what we want, then something as simple as checking a box should not impact how we decide. By the way, in the United States, just for the ethnocentric amongst us, 85% of Americans say they intend to become organ donors. 28% of us follow through.
Well, still better than Germany, though.
Way better than Germany. Those Germans, they hold on to their organs like nobody's business.
Man, it's crazy. I hope we have no German listeners. I'm almost positive we don't. And if they do, they don't speak. Well, no, they probably do. It's not important.
I love lots of things about Germany, by the way. We can have the German appreciation podcast. Are not
dismal. But that'll be the subject of a next podcast. So we've talked about framing. We've talked about the power of the opt-in. Are there any other sort of major behavioral economic tools that we should be aware of?
Oh gosh, there are so many that I don't want to overwhelm your listeners. I'll give you my last favorite one. It's something called psychological reactance. And this explains why you should never ever say to your teenage daughter, under no circumstances are you to date that boy. And here's the reason why. Human beings value our freedom to choose more than the choices themselves. So when you say that to your daughter, all she's now thinking about is not, do I like this boy? Is this boy right for me? She's thinking, how do I reassert my autonomy to make this decision for myself? And so she is therefore going to embrace the boy, even if she doesn't like him, just to demonstrate that she gets to make the choice for herself. So when I learned about psychological reactance, I found myself trying to stop saying to people, have a nice day, because I thought that unconsciously they were thinking to themselves, what if I don't want to have a nice day? So now I say, I hope you have a nice day, and I think that everything has gotten better since.
The whole world. I've noticed a change in the atmosphere just in general from when you started that. It is fun. I'm always surprised. I have met over the course of my life maybe 5 people who openly objected to that. So who would say, I don't have to have a nice day. Like, what is wrong with you? But it's that, like you said, it's that reassertion of independence and of agency and control over their own lives. Well, I think from those tools you talked about, I think there's some obvious applications or at least ways to start thinking about how you interact, certainly with clients, also with staff and so on, in terms of paying attention to the presentation of information and how you phrase and how you frame choices for them. But maybe, I don't know if you have any specific examples of ways maybe you think that accountants can apply this in their business on a regular basis.
Well, you know, I think about 3 different ways. And in this regard, I actually think that the accounting industry is similar to most other industries that are looking at artificial intelligence and machine learning fundamentally transforming the landscape over the next 5 to 25 years. And those are internal, external, and transformational. So during periods of extreme change, driving employee engagement becomes very difficult and very important. And so one classic example that I think that HR practitioners not paying attention to behavioral economics can make is by trying to target the things that should drive employee engagement. And when you do a little bit deeper digging into the research, what you find is that the things you would think drive employee engagement are not what actually does it. And so I think that taking a behavioral approach to employee engagement internally, and there are some wonderful studies that show what actually drives employee engagement, but doing that next level of discovery will help organizations understand what they can do best to drive engagement within their own organizations, both to drive retention and performance. Interestingly enough, one of the things that is a key contributor to employee engagement is the development of new skills and new talents. And so one thing that I think that internally organizations can do is try to introduce more aggressively development programs, new trainings, new skill development, because you're killing 2 birds with 1 stone. You're both driving the engagement within your own organization, and you're broadening the service offerings that you can provide to clients externally. When we think about how to go external, I think that understanding how we can structure our communications and our programs in ways that will enable our clients to understand the crucial distinctions between various paths that they can take, and helping them make smarter decisions by understanding what's going to drive their motivation to make those choices is a pretty clear application of the whole idea of behavioral economics. And then lastly, I would say that behavioral economics itself is an interesting area for the accounting industry to consider. I think that given this sort of quantitative background, as we start to look into more qualitative psychological stuff, how those 2 things can marry offers a really interesting opportunity. And what I would say is that behavioral economics, not only has the ship not yet sailed, it hasn't even left the port. There's a really important book called Nudge that came out in 2008. And I think most people in my world consider that to be the kickoff point for when behavioral economics started exploding. That's 10 years ago. This field is expanding so fast and growing so rapidly, but really the only place that it's taken a foothold is in the British government. In fact, they created something that's now lovingly known as the Nudge Unit, where they looked at how can they start applying behavioral economics to public policy to drive the welfare of their citizenry. In terms of the practice of human capital management, in terms of how we are considering change management and the like, these are all really fresh territories. And so I think that organizations can use behavioral economics to help their clients understand how to focus better on operations, how to focus better on driving employee engagement, and understanding what the impacts are to the quantitative metrics by which the organization is evaluated. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunity here, particularly for accountants as they become more strategic consultants as technology takes on more of the sort of implementation tasks that they have traditionally done.
Right. I'm glad you brought up Nudge, because I think it was in the context of Nudge that I first heard of that, the 401k. I think that was one of its famous examples.
Yes.
But I got two questions for you as we think about it. I mean, I think there's a lot of obvious applications for accountants, particularly as they move to be more value-added advisors. Among other things, a lot of what this has to do is how you interact with people and how you present choices and options and information to them. And that's going to be vastly more important as they move into areas that are not, let's say, not as controlled by forms, right? If you're filling out a tax return, there's only so many ways you can fill it out. There's only so many ways you can present that information because it's the form determining it. It's the accounting standards determine what the books look like. But as you expand your interactions with them, the importance of figuring out how you talk to them and how you take their behavior into account is going to matter a lot more. And similarly, you mentioned, I mean, recruiting and retention, and that's going to be huge. It's huge for accountants right now. The war for talent is enormous. So the scope for application there is tremendous. But like I said, I have two quick questions. One, and I'm just curious about this, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, but as you look at it, we say, well, we're pretty terrible at understanding what motivates people. I mean, obviously there's some areas where we get it right, but there's so many where we don't. And I wonder, why do you think that is? Is it just because they're rational? I mean, we all sort of know that human beings have been irrational. Why are we so terrible, or have been sort of so often so terrible at figuring out what motivates people?
Well, I would say that if there's one idea that kind of connects everything in behavioral economics, it's this, is that we're limited. We do not have perfect brains. And so we have lots of biases and what's called heuristics that we employ. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we take to try to make fast sense of a very complicated situation, when we have time pressure, when we have incomplete information, when something actually exceeds our own ability. We have to rely on biases and heuristics to come up with very quick answers. And there are so many psychological needs buried deep within that. So how I assess a situation, if it's going to have an impact on how I feel about myself, then my assessment is going to be severely impacted by my emotional needs. So that would be an example of what gets in our way collectively of being better at executing rational judgment. So I think that there are some mechanical issues, there are some emotional issues, but the good news is, and this is where I think accountants may in fact have a leg up, is that where our understanding is actually coming from is data. It's experimentation and data and replicatable results. So, for example, I don't know that anyone would have necessarily guessed that one application of psychological reactance is something we call the "but you are free" technique. So the same way that when you issue an order to someone, they become much less likely to say yes, if on the flip side you say, "you are free to choose, but ... they're much more likely to say yes. And I don't think anybody would have intuited this, but it's only through experimentation, data gathering, replicating results that we can start to have an understanding of, hey, this stuff really works. And so it does require a scientific mind first to come up with the concepts, design experiments that can prove them, and that's kind of the science. The art then becomes, once we understand this "but you are free" technique, what are the cool ways we can apply it? And that's the art.
Well, and now for anyone who's thinking, well, this also sounds great, but it sounds a little theoretical, you guys have actually applied this to a product, right?
Yes. So we at ADP were trying to understand what was really behind employee engagement. And the further that we dug into it, what we came up with was, it's the dynamics between people. It's, how does your boss treat you? What's the experience like with your colleagues? What needs are being fulfilled or not being fulfilled? It's not things like salary or title or vacation time. It's about the day-to-day experience that you have with other people. And so we created a product called Compass that tried to both reinvent the assessment. And so, for example, for a leader, we would ask questions of the team, create a feedback report that was shared only with the leader, because we knew if we shared it with anyone else, the likelihood of the leader embracing the feedback goes down. And from that, we created a series of weekly emails based on the feedback within that data to understand how could the leader best serve the needs of the team. And to do that, we created a weekly nudge. We created email-based coaching where what we were really using was the subject lines. So for example, let's say that I as a leader received feedback that my team didn't feel sufficiently recognized. For the next 8 weeks. Each week I'm going to get an email that says, week 1, recognition. Here's why coach thinks you're cool. Week 2, recognition. What's the 6 evidence? Which is a made up word, by the way. Week 3, recognition. Other people are the worst. And so what we're doing is we're employing a technique known as priming. And so what that means is we're raising the cognitive availability of the concept of recognition. Every time I see that word recognition pop up in my subject line, I'm being reminded, oh yeah, recognition was my lowest score. That's what I'm getting coached on. So even if I don't read the rest of this coaching email, at a minimum, recognition is on my mind, which we see ends up driving people's behavior. And so sure enough, Compass has helped us generate 10% improvements from a grand total of 16 minutes worth of work just by deploying behavioral economics. And so we know that as we improve leadership and we improve collaboration, we are dramatically impacting employee engagement. So having run this within ADP for several years now, we've seen that the approach works incredibly well. And what I always like to explain to people is that leadership development has been a really complicated problem for a long time. Anybody who reads the Harvard Business Review knows that just about every issue has an article about leadership development doesn't work and you can't measure it. And here we are, first time out of the gate. And not only are we generating these 10% improvements, we're measuring it and demonstrating the impact. And the thing is that this was not a breakthrough in leadership. We don't know anything about leadership that everybody else doesn't also know. We're all working from the same knowledge base. What this was the successful application of behavioral economics. We made great guesses about how people would actually behave and would react to all the things that we put in front of them. And sure enough, it worked this well. And I would say this is the beginning of what I think we're going to see of how behavioral economics is going to start being applied to traditionally very complicated and challenging problems and really start turning the tide in terms of how we address them and what kind of impacts we can create.
Awesome. That's very cool. The product is Compass. The book is Nudge, always worth a look.
Yes.
And the subject is behavioral economics. It's like you said, it's early days, but its potential for accountants to apply it to themselves, their staff, their clients is pretty awesome.
It's still early, and so I encourage everyone to start reading up on behavioral economics, considering how it can be applied in their workplace. And if nothing else, what I can tell you is that it makes for a really good party conversation. So that's your safety net.
All right, with that, we're going to go to a party now. Jordan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks for listening. Look for new episodes of On the Air with Accounting Today every Monday at accountingtoday.com or subscribe to us on Google Play or iTunes. And if there's a topic you'd like us to explore, let us know by emailing actoday@sourcemedia.com.